I'm Dr. Alexandra Katehakis, and today is Monday, February 3rd. Today we're going to be talking about pleasure, which is a lovely topic for December, I think. A few things, as always, before we start. I want to remind you to type your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box if you want me to see the questions. In the chat box, you will find references to resources, whether it's a book I talk about or questions you might have about Center for Healthy Sex and how to get in touch with us. So I'll answer your questions from the Q&A box as we go along. And also, I always ask you to please leave a review or any kind of comments you have on Amazon for what turns you on. Let us know what you love about the book, how you're using the workbook. It's very helpful to readers when they're searching for help, and they see that other people have enjoyed the book. And if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel by clicking on the subscribe button below. And that way you'll never miss a post and you know what's going on. You can also keep up with what we're doing by following me on Instagram at Alex Katehakis or at Center for Healthy Sex. And lastly, make sure to sign up for our mailing list by clicking the link in the chat box so you can keep up with upcoming events, webinars, services, and anything else we might have going on here at Center for Healthy Sex. So this webinar series, for those of you that might be new to it, is exploring different aspects of my workbook, which is called What Turns You On? A Guide to Living Your Best Sex Life. And this book came out just towards the end of last year, and maybe end of 23, beginning of 24. You'll find the link for it in the chat box if you're interested. And this book is designed to help you get honest with yourself about how you define sex, how you think about sexuality, and the kind of touch you might enjoy, sexual activities you really enjoy, and how you can have explicit and meaningful exchanges with a sexual partner. So when I was thinking about this book, it was really a number of staff members here at CHS that encouraged me to write it because we were talking constantly about just how different everybody's sexual preferences are and how much the media, social media especially, and popular culture kind of defines what we're supposed to like sexually and who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to want and not want. And people were feeling or reporting that they were just kind of losing their own sexuality and getting lost in the din of what was out there. So this workbook is meant to help you break things down into very simple parts and to get honest with yourself first and foremost, because we're changing all the time. And what we liked sexually 5 years ago, we might not even think about today. And there may be things we haven't even thought about that we want to try. So go easy on yourself and be willing to be plastic in your thinking and stretch out and consider possibilities as we go along in our conversation today. And also, if you choose to look at the workbook. And really, when you have clarity about yourself, then you can start to have clarity with a partner. But until you can get honest with yourself about what you really like sexually, what you want, what you enjoy, what's fun for you, you can't really communicate that to a partner. And if you can't communicate it to a partner, then you really can't be intimate. And when I say intimate, the way you build intimacy is through conversations, um, certainly through sex and sexuality. But without the conversations, you have no idea if you're on the right path or not, or on the same path together. And it's interesting how many people don't want to have those conversations because they're too afraid of what they're going to find out. They're going to find out that this person that they love, that they've cared about for a lifetime sometimes, just doesn't click with them sexually. And then they've got to make a decision about, do I stay or do I go? And what does sex and sexuality mean to me? They become very big questions, in other words. So for now, Let's stick to pleasure. So there's a classic myth that was told by Ovid, Ovid, which you can look up. Um, and it was about pleasure being the daughter of Eros. And Eros, as we all know, was the god of love and Psyche. So when Eros and Psyche got together, they had this beautiful daughter named Pleasure. Um, and Psyche was not a goddess. She was an earthly creature. Um, and she made him immortal. So when Eros got together with Psyche, he became immortal. And the name Psyche shares the same root as the word psychology. It means spirit or mind. So one interpretation of this ancient story shows us that pleasure is born from mindfulness, from psyche, and a uniting intention of eros. So I'm going to say that again, that pleasure is born from mindfulness, from our psyche. What am I thinking? What do I like? What don't I like? How much attention have I put on this? And when we unite that with our intention, which was Eros, if you remember, Eros had uh, arrows also. Actually, it was Cupid that had the arrows that created Eros or love, but there was an intention in the arrow. And I've often described erotic intelligence as the deliberate seeking of pleasure with the skilled use of reason. So these are similar ways of thinking about this, that there's nothing wrong with eroticism or the seeking of pleasure. But when we have an intentionality or we have an intelligence about it, we are using our reasonable skills also. So we're actually shuttling back and forth between both sides of our brain. The logical, intelligent part of us that tells us to use reason, versus the right brain, which is the more emotional, broad-based possibility parts of the brain. This can sound like an erotic formula for every coupling, from internet dating and cruising, if you're cruising for sex in bathrooms or tea rooms or spas, to sexual surrogacy and marriage. They can be counterintuitive, but pleasure requires planning and self-knowledge in the same way that vacations can take as much effort and thought as work can sometimes. So when you really plan a vacation, when you know the kind of trip you want to take, I heard somebody talking about that recently, that, you can vacation as a tourist, you can vacation as an explorer, or you can vacation as a pilgrim. And those are three different ways of vacationing. And none of them are right or wrong or good or bad. It's just knowing what you're looking for. So I think the tourist goes on a tour, a cruise, something that's pre-planned where everything's laid out for them. And an explorer kind of goes with a loose itinerary and just sees what happens. But a pilgrim is really going and diving deeply, looking to stretch their soul in a particular way. So it's not the safest way of taking a trip. And so all of these ways of being, like I said, whether you're cruising for sex anonymously, or you're looking for a sexual surrogate, or you're deciding to get married, they require an intentionality, a planning of how you're going to do it. And sexual feelings can set off all kinds of nerve bundles and neural chemicals within the body that feel more intense and immediate than enjoyable activities activate, because there is an intensity to sexual feelings. And we don't want to confuse that intensity with intimacy. And sex creates pleasurable sensations that are definitely distinctly personal. So when people say, well, it's not personal, it is personal. We're all activated, we're all turned on. We all have preferences in different ways. So we want to be mindful about these intense and immediate feelings that come around, and that which is pleasurable and distinctly personal to us. And that is a big part of how the workbook works also, getting you to really think about and feel into your body about what turns you on. Is it just an idea or is it a felt sense? And this could be one of the reasons that our sex organs are called private parts, not because they have to be kept private, but because intensely pleasurable sensations are experienced so individually. They are so private, individual, personal to who we are. And it's really important to give yourself a lot of space to hear that and to enjoy it. There's some people that have very high pain thresholds and other people who have very low pain thresholds. And those people are probably not going to be compatible sexually because they're going to want very different things. And that could be problematic going forward. So I've talked about this before that I wish people would talk about their sexual preferences when they were dating because they talk about what kind of movies they like and how they like to travel and what kind of vacations they want to go on, or that they don't like to travel, what kind of food they like, everything. But rarely do people talk about what kind of sex they like and what kind of touch they like and what kind of experiences they want to have, because it's just so taboo. We're taught not to talk about those parts of ourselves. And yet they are essential parts to our well-being over time, especially in a long-term relationship. So this requires an effort to share our sexual pleasure with a partner. And to show pleasure is to grow pleasure because the more you can show what's pleasurable to you to someone else, the more that reduces your shame and your self-consciousness, the more likely you are to show more pleasure as time goes on. So this can be a building process between two people. Um, and I mean, it's for ourselves as we learn about ourselves and as we share with another person. But, unfortunately, our society tends to disdain any open display of sexuality, regardless of whether it's healthy or destructive, or to have any kind of conversation about it. So you have to ask yourself if you're compulsively pursuing pleasure, especially related to sex or love, then ask yourself how much of the hunt is actually unpleasurable. How much of what you're doing compulsively is unpleasurable, whether it's, eating compulsively, shopping compulsively, obsessing about somebody, be falling in love, in and out of love constantly, or having compulsive sex. Like, at what point does it become unpleasurable? When does it become painful even, and you wish you weren't doing it? So I'm not talking about that kind of pursuit of pleasure. I'm talking about the pursuit of pleasure that actually feels good now. So whenever preceding or resulting pain is greater than the momentary payoff, we should question the effectiveness of what we're doing. We should really ask ourselves, is this good for me, what I'm up to? Or is this something I'm just doing out of habit or because I don't know what else to do? So what is really true for you there? And we can ask ourselves whether the enjoyment creates memories and anecdotes for years to come that we'll enjoy, or are they memories that have to be crushed and hidden? So think about what brings you pleasure and how you share your pleasure with others. So somebody asked a question here. How does one build back sexual intimacy in a marriage after not having it for years due to an illness? Well, hopefully I've answered that question just in what I've been talking about, that it starts with conversations. You would sit down and talk to your partner about what the illness stole from you, what it took away from you, how much time you've had without consort, as it were, and what both of you are thinking about in terms of having a sex life again together. And how could you start small with just simple touch and affection and start to define sexuality in a way that isn't about performance or penetration, but what would feel sexually good to both of you? That would be the beginning conversation. So, do you narrate the enjoyable sensations you receive to your partner, like making a report? Or do you convey your feelings wordlessly with sounds or facial expressions? Or do you count on their being communicated by themselves as through osmosis? Like, what is your style of communicating pleasure to your partner? Or maybe you shuttle back and forth between all those different styles, or you have a unique one of your own. But just know what that is. I worry that all too often people feel like they have to mind read what their partner does and doesn't like because they don't talk about it. Or when they do, they feel shame. So the conversations are sort of cursory. So, how do you communicate pleasure? And how does your partner communicate pleasure? And do you want to know more about your partner's communication and pleasure? So, as you go forward into this month of love, where we're surrounded by all sorts of hearts and sayings about love and loving, take the time to experience your own pleasure today and let yourself show it. So, this might be, drinking a delicious cup of coffee and feeling how good it feels and the delicious sound you make when you sip it, like, that's really good. That's a way of experiencing pleasure and showing pleasure that's appropriate in whatever setting you're at, whether it's with a friend or at work. But first, practice alone when you get into deeper types of pleasure, and relay your feelings out loud. Maybe you have a meal by yourself, and as you're tasting the food and it's delicious, if you are unbridled in how you talked about how it feels on your tongue or what it tastes like in your mouth, and you really allowed yourself to experience the pleasure of that, what would that sound and look like? We often talk about food being orgasmic. So let yourself have a foodgasm, and share it with a partner, maybe. And then when you feel comfortable sharing your sexual pleasure that you have with yourself, for example, through self-pleasuring, and you're comfortable with your own pleasure, can you practice sharing that experience with your lover? Certainly, when you share your experiences of pleasure with other people, that should be something, again, that's appropriate within the range of sharing with other people, like food or a scent that you smelled this weekend when you were in a department store, or some sensation that you just love that you want other people to experience and know about too. Maybe it was a great massage, or you went into a sound bath, or you went to a flotation tank, things of that nature. So, masturbation obviously is a form of self-pleasure that comes to mind when we think about pleasure. It's certainly a healthy part of human sexuality, and it's an inherent gift. I mean, the design of the human body gives us free access to our genitals, and that makes it the easiest way to learn about our own sexuality. So, whatever your spiritual beliefs might be, it's clear that this function was granted for our enjoyment, whether we're single or we're partnered. So, taking the shame out of masturbation is really essential to enjoy the pleasure of your body and the sensations of your body. And when you think about it as healthy, when we experience joy at delighting ourselves and caring in erotic ways, that is without shame or self-abuse attached to the act or the accompanying fantasy, um, masturbation becomes a way for you to figure out what you do and don't like sexually. So if you don't masturbate, ask yourself, why not? What does it mean to you? Where do you get hung up about it? If it's shameful, why is it shameful? And if you do, what do you like about it? Are you doing it in the same way you've been doing it for 10, 15 years? Are you curious about what your erotic template might be and whether you're willing to try something else? Are you using a fantasy that's part of maybe historical abuse or sexual abuse? Do you need to, in other words, clean up the images in your head or the arousal template because it's actually not additive? It makes you feel bad about yourself afterwards. So I'm actually asking you to do a deep examination of masturbation and to deconstruct it in a way that has you understanding yourself better. And so we talk a lot about self-love, but when we talk about self-love and being present, consider that masturbation is a clear inroad to loving ourselves, especially in the moment without focusing on orgasm. Somebody writes here, after a deep sex addiction and betrayal, I'm 2.5 years sober. My wife is not ready to or healed enough to engage in conversation with me sexually. I'd like to consider taking back my own self-pleasure sexually in a healthy way to connect without shame to these parts. Doing or even suggesting this would likely create distance in my marriage, opposite of what I want. I feel stuck and trapped at times in my sexuality. How do I rebuild this? Well, this is a very commonly asked question for people in recovery from sex addiction. And this is where, after 2.5 years, you really should be in couples therapy if you're not already, because this becomes a deep sticking point. And when the partner doesn't feel safe or comfortable, but there's no end in sight to when that safety and comfort is going to come. So, in other words, the person isn't saying, look, I know this has been a hard road and long road, and I haven't been ready for sex for 2.5 years, but I imagine if I stay in my therapy and we keep doing this work together, I can see where I would be ready to talk about it in 6 months. Like, there is an intention of the partner to start to move towards a sex life together again. But if that intention isn't there and this starts to move into 3 years, it's very difficult for the person who is sober in recovery to be expected to not have a sex life the rest of their lives. And I know that can be a wildly unpopular position, but penalizing somebody for their sex and sexuality is not recovery, and it's not love either. So couples have to work this out, and they've got to work it out together. And then when somebody in recovery from sex addiction starts to integrate masturbation into their sexuality, they really need to be doing that in conversations with a therapist and a sponsor, other fellows in program, so that there's an accountability for when it's done, why it's done, how long, how often. So there are parameters around it, so it doesn't just become this, sort of slippery slope, as they say, back into addiction. And if the addict is taking responsibility for that and taking measures for it to be healthy and safe, then the partner's going to feel a lot better about that if they know sort of what the parameters are, versus, hey, I'm doing this again, and it doesn't matter what you think or feel, and I don't know how it's going to go for me. I'm just going to find out. So it should be um, monitored by a sponsor. There should be rules and parameters around it, which I'm not going to get into in detail here, but there are definitely ways of working with this. But again, you have to do it as a couple. You've got to do it together. It isn't one person's problem. Both people have to be involved in these conversations, because there's a paradox here. It is about your sex life together, but each person gets to have their own personal sex life. All right, thank you for that question. So I was talking about self-love and being present, and that masturbation is an inroad into loving ourselves in the moment without focusing on orgasm. And when you are engaging in self-pleasure, pay close attention to your pleasure and your arousal cycles by listening to the cues from your body. See if you can masturbate without fantasy. What does that feel like? Is it possible? What is it like to focus strictly on the sensations in your body as a form of self-care, as opposed to, I really got to conjure up some fantasy in order to have an orgasm, which are very different experiences. And if you're up for it, you can keep a journal where you track what you're experiencing emotionally, physically, and spiritually, before and after you masturbate. Think about how you prefer to masturbate. If there's a certain hand you like to use, or what kind of pressure you enjoy, the most comfortable location. And if you make sounds, or if you're breathing shallow, like, Be an observer of your own experience. In other words, be your own best lover as you're figuring out who you are. Because once you understand what you're experiencing during masturbation, you should be able to imagine talking about it with a partner in a matter-of-fact way. Because you keep deconstructing your shame, you keep eliminating your self-consciousness, your shame, and then you should be able to feel self-pleasure and self-love without shame and judgment. Because when shame and judgment are gone, then you're really liberated. And if shame arrives uninvited, then remember that you're in control. Just gently ask shame to leave. If it resists, imagine putting it into a locked and sealed container where it can't get out, and just tell it to go sit over there for a little while. But just let those feelings, those thoughts really come in, and gently ask them to go away. And if they're overwhelming, obviously you're going to have to stop and do some writing or journaling about what just happened. So finally, I want you to remember that your sexuality is yours. You get to experience it, define it, and enjoy it in an unencumbered way. And I just want to state again, just to be clear, that sex should always be consensual. It should never be unilateral. But when it comes to your own personal sex life and your own self-pleasuring techniques and interests and rituals, that gets to be unilateral because it's you and your body. So I hope that this little conversation about pleasure helps you start to play around with the edges of shame and judgment and messages that maybe you got that weren't that useful when you were young, a child growing up, and see if you can start to deconstruct those messages and reclaim your body as your own and your pleasure as your own. All right. Well, thank you for listening to this webinar. I hope you have a beautiful, pleasurable day in whatever ways you can, and that the month of November, or not November, February, treats you well and with love. And I look forward to seeing you next week when we meet again. All right. Thank you and take care.